Hi, everyone. This is Dr. Gayle Carson. Welcome to Living Regret Free, a program that shows you how to live a better and more joyful life. As an added bonus, I invite you to listen to an introduction to my Mindset Matters program, which ties into this so well. Go to www.sobmindset.com. It's free, and I know you will enjoy it. If you'd like to contact me personally, drop me a line at gaylecarson13@gmail.com or go to my website, www.spunkyoldbroad.com, and sign up for my weekly newsletter.
Hi, everyone. I have a terrific guest for you today. Her name is Linda Olson, and she is the author of the #1 best-selling book, Your Story Matters: Three Breakthrough Secrets to Stories That Transform. She's also an international speaker and a sought-after story expert, and is the founder and CEO of Wealth Through Stories. With a double master's degree, this former college dean, a marriage and family therapist, and award-winning entrepreneur, combines decades of public speaking and writing experience with her own moving personal story to form the basis of Your Story Matters. Her mission is to impact 1 million people a year as she trains entrepreneurs, speakers, and leaders to find and share the wealth in their story. She resides in Southern California with her husband, Rick, two beautiful daughters, handsome son-in-laws, and adorable grandchildren who are the best part of her story. Welcome, Linda. How are you?
Oh, thank you. I'm doing great. Such a joy to be with you.
Well, it's a wonderful thing to have people who love to tell stories, because stories do make everybody remember the main point that you're trying to convey. So that's important, and you're going to tell us how to do that. So why don't you start off by telling us what is story and why it's so important?
Well, very simply, a story is sharing an experience. I mean, whether that happened this morning or whether it happened years ago, that's really as simple as it is. It's really sharing an experience. And it is important because it's the #1 way that we connect with each other. It's also the #1 way to impact people because it's exactly what you said. It's what we remember. We remember stories more than anything else. And that takes us to our third area, and that is because people experience you through story. We experience each other through story.
When people are trained as speakers, if they're doing a keynote, which is about 30 to 45 minutes, they always say never make more than 3 points, and whatever 3 points you make, back it up with a story, because that's what the audience is going to remember. So why do you think it is that we fail to use this #1 tool that we have to reach the people who we want to reach?
Well, sadly enough, as I did some research, I discovered it is because most people don't think they have a story. They actually don't think they have a story, which is so far from the truth. Everybody has a story.
Well, I guess, that's true, because people think, well, whatever happens to them, nobody else would be interested in, or it applies only to them. And it's just like when people say to me, oh, Gail, you've had such an interesting life. And I have. I've had a wonderful life. But then there are things that I think, well, nobody would really be interested in that, and yet they are. So it's very interesting. So what do you think the three biggest mistakes are that we make when it comes to stories?
Well, we really touched on the first two, and that first one is that we don't think we have a story. So we have to change our mindset to believing and knowing that we do have a story. Everybody has a story. And secondly, you actually said it, and that is that even if we could come up with something to share, things of your past or whatever it may be, we think that most people don't even want to hear it. And that isn't true. People do want to hear it. And thirdly, if we came up with something, we think, well, I don't have a clue how to tell this.
Well, I guess that's right, because most people don't think they're that interesting, even though they are, you know. So, what what should be the foundational elements, and what are the things people should look for when they are telling a story?
Well, I'm going to give you the simple story framework. And when people understand and grasp this, they will begin to look at story differently. And that is the number one element, the key part of story is conflict. I mean, if you think for a minute about watching a movie, I'm sure I haven't seen a movie without conflict. They have lots of conflict in movie, and that's what keeps us engaged because that's what we connect to. So if we just consider conflict in our life, we all have lots of conflict, and that's part of our story. Then behind every conflict is a resolution. And so that's an important part of the story element as well. And then we can go back and add an introduction. And often the introduction is introducing the conflict. So, very simply, it's introduction, conflict, resolution.
Yeah, I'm trying to think now. I'm thinking of, I was, just thinking about, you mentioned movies, and I was trying to think in comedies if there's conflict. I guess there is. Certainly in action, certainly in drama, there is. And but comedy is a little bit harder. But I guess that's one of the traits of comedy is that they have some kind of a conflict, which they resolve in a humorous way. So um, you talk about finding more stories though than we can count. How can someone be sure if they have a story? I mean, I guess you have to look at what happens to you in a day or a week or a month or a year and say, would anybody be interested in that? Or how does someone pull a story out of someone?
You know, sometimes I think we make this way too hard. We're looking for those big stories or those things that have transformed our lives, and those are certainly part of story. I think of story in three main categories. One is our everyday stories, things that happen to us just on an everyday basis. It may be something as simple as what someone said to us that all of a sudden just triggered um, something emotionally within us. It might be something that we observed and saw happen. Those are our everyday stories. Our past stories, now there may be big stories that we have, or another area is what I call our turning point stories. Those are stories that have had a significant effect on our life, and it's something that we've learned through it. So somehow in our life, they've changed our life. I mean, they may be things like um, a wedding, our first baby, a grandchild, or they may be things like perhaps renewing a relationship with a teenage son or daughter, or getting our first job, or getting a promotion, or those kind of things. Things that have had a significant impact in our life. And of course, there's different times to tell different stories depending on who you're talking to. But we can be sure we have a story by going back to that key element I talked about earlier, and that is that whole idea of conflict. Everybody has conflict, and then sometimes conflict is resolved immediately. I mean, it doesn't have to be, we think of conflict often as something negative. It doesn't have to be negative. It may be as simple as making a decision. Do I do this now? Or do I put this aside and focus on something else right now? And, these are the results of it. So it may be a story, but it's like if we start thinking about it as conflict could be the beginning of a new story.
Yeah, and as you were talking, I was thinking, there's probably some stories nobody wants to tell, and there's probably some stories that people would be embarrassed to tell, even though it might be a great life lesson. But I'm just thinking, you mentioned some things, and I have some friends that, have these stories going on, and they make them into these productions. I mean, things that they don't need to be as conflicted as they are, and they make the conflict themselves. I'm thinking to myself, this is so simple. Why why are you doing this? So, there's a lot that's involved in that. So, how how do we find stories that make big impacts?
Well, that's really about knowing who we're talking to. So whether that's on a one-on-one and we hear their story, perhaps they're sharing something painful with us, or whether that's speaking, like you mentioned, a keynote, perhaps doing a keynote in front of a large audience, or it could be a small group, a group of 10, 15 people or so. But if we know the audience and know and hear their pain, it can trigger something in our life that that included pain. I mean, it may be something we all fear is the number one negative emotion. We all experience fear every time we step into something new or different, something we haven't done before. We experience a sense of fear, and someone may be coming to us and sharing with us that they were so afraid of starting this new job. And immediately it triggers for me when I started my first job or my new job where I was absolutely terrified. And as we turn around and share, you know what? I so clearly remember the day that I went in to start my new job. And here we are identifying with them. And it doesn't even have to be the same circumstance. It may be a totally different circumstance, but we're identifying with their fear. We're identifying with the emotion. And when they hear that, that will be a comfort, a support, an encouragement to them, and it will have an impact. It's something as simple as that. Really identifying with the pain, the problems, the emotions that people are experiencing.
Well, you say that you have a big story. Uh, would you be willing to share it?
I would. I do have a very big story, but what's interesting before I go into it, I will share with you that until I came to complete healing with my story, I didn't even realize I had a story. My story goes way back to when I was 14 years of age, and through a tractor accident, my 2 year old, precious little 2 year old brother was killed. I was the one driving the tractor. And so, as you can only imagine, um, at 14 years of age, even though that was young for driving the tractor, we did that on the farm. Everybody got to drive the implements early. And it wasn't the first, certainly not the first time I'd driven it. But that moment, and little Billy actually, his last words were he verbalized them while I was holding them. I was cradling him in the back seat of our car when my dad raced 90 miles an hour to the nearest hospital. And as I cradled him in the back seat, he said, "Owie, Nina." And those were his last words. That moment changed my life forever.
I can believe that. That is really, I mean, that is not just a story. That is um, complete, just a different alignment in your life.
Absolutely, yes. And it was a long journey to healing, a very long journey. But when I look back and realized I had learned so much through this journey, and it has really made me who I am today. And not only that, it is why I am helping thousands of people, in fact, millions, to impact others with their story. It's why I'm doing what I'm doing today is all traced back to that initial moment.
But I would think, Linda, that it not only really works on where you are now in the storytelling and all of that. But it had to have a huge impact on your entire life. I mean, I can't even
Absolutely.
fathom this. So, I mean, that had to be something that shaped you in ways that you can't even express.
Absolutely, it did. One, I, of course, had to learn to walk through um, all my pain. And the hardest part was in this little community where I grew up. And way back then, that was in 1966. So, way back then, there was no counseling, there was no support group. And the community was a caring community, but they didn't understand grief. They didn't understand that I so badly, I needed to be able to just talk about it. And and their thinking was that if they would talk to me about it, it would just trigger my pain. So instead, nobody talked to me about it. And that was very, very hard. And it wasn't until 15 years later that I got into therapy, and my therapist had identified my guilt that I had buried so deep, had identified it very quickly. And she worked with me for quite some time. And of course, the biggest thing was that I had to come to grips with was forgiving myself. It was probably the hardest conversation I've ever had. But it was such a huge relief. And this part of all of this, I developed a much deeper compassion for people and a sensitivity to people. And it was really what took me into my former career, which was marriage and family therapy.
You know, it's that's what I'm saying. It just has such a big effect on everyone. Now, not everyone has that kind of a story, but just think if you hadn't gone for therapy, and just think if that wasn't available even later for you in life, how things might have turned out differently. But you also talk about impacting people with a big story like yours in 2 minutes or less. And I have a couple of questions about that. Number one, why does it have to be in 2 minutes? And what if it isn't 2 minutes? What if it's longer? I mean, what is the impact there?
Okay. Let me respond to that first, and then I'll share an example. The 2 minutes has to do with our attention spans. Um, they say when I worked for a few years with a story coach, and she said any great story should be no longer than 2 or 3 minutes because our attention spans are so short. And often you'll hear people tell stories, and sometimes they just go on and on and on. Well, they lose us. We may still be glaring at them, but our mind is, we're picking up groceries, we're making dinner, we're doing all kinds
Totally agree with you. Totally agree. Right.
of. And so that's what happens. So that's where the 2 minutes comes in. So let me give you an example. Let's say I'm a financial planner. A young couple comes in to speak to me. They're 30 years of age, $100,000 in debt without their mortgage, and have no idea how they could ever get beyond their debt. And so that's their story. I listen to their story, and then I may just say to them, do you mind if I just take a minute and share my story? And of course, they would say yes. And I said, at 14 years of age, through a tractor accident, my precious 2-year old brother was killed. I was the one driving the tractor. I may not know what it's like to carry the financial debt that you are carrying, but I do know what it's like to carry the debt of guilt and shame. And I will tell you, if you're willing to work with me, and follow what I give you, I know that I can have you out of debt in 2 years or less. Do you see how I basically identified with their emotion, knew that it took a lot of courage to come in just to share their story with me, but then I identified with the debt through the pain that I had gone through. And so initially, they may have come in and there was an initial trust. Now, within 1 or 2 minutes, as short time as that, we've taken the trust to a whole new level. And once the trust is there, now they're much more open to working with me.
Yeah, that's really good. And I guess it's important to know how to develop all of this. So if if someone wanted to learn more about story, what are three things that they could use?
Well, you're absolutely right. It is a skill. And I've worked on this for several years, so it doesn't come overnight. But like anything, it comes with practice. And there are three things that I would like to recommend. One is my book, Your Story Matters. Of course, you can pick that up on Amazon. I was very pleased when it became an Amazon bestseller in 7 countries in the first 5 days.
Wow, that's
And
that's
that
impressive. That's impressive.
and that just told me, I mean, I stepped back and I thought, what's this about? And I realized how badly people need to know that their story matters. So I would recommend that. If anybody would like to join me on my website, wealththroughstories.com, and at the bottom of the first page, you can sign up for a free 30-minute consultation, and I'd be happy to talk to anybody about their story. And the other thing is, um, I have a free 5 day transformational story, how to create your transformational story through a 5 day challenge that I'm giving away right now as a gift to you and your audience. And if someone wants to just go to wealththroughstories.com/create, they will find that 5 day transformational story on there.
Wow, that's very generous of you. Um, wow, so there is a way to make this a part of everybody's life, really. But what do you think comes from keeps us from telling our bigger stories?
You know what? Our bigger stories, um, we cannot share them without being vulnerable. They have to come from the heart for it to really impact people. And you know what happens? Um, there's always a risk in being vulnerable because we don't know if people will receive it or not. And so what often comes up is that fear of rejection. And it takes a lot of courage to be able to share our vulnerable stories, especially with people that we don't know, because we don't know where they're coming from. We don't know what it will trigger for them. For somebody may be so appreciative and truly just so grateful that they're shared. The next person, it may trigger pain that they have not addressed, and they will turn away. They will turn around and walk away from you. And of course, it's easy to think, oh my goodness, what did I say? I didn't mean to hurt them. I didn't, we get into all of that. So I believe more than anything, it's that fear of vulnerability that keeps us from sharing. But on the flip side of that is it may not be that everybody's ready to hear it, but what about the audience that is ready and that really needs to hear it? For some of them, it will transform their life. And to me, I can't think of anything more exciting than to be able to have a small part in transforming somebody else's life.
Wow, that is really, really powerful. Well, Linda, so if people want to get in touch with you, they can go to your website, wealththroughstories.com. And then if they want that additional knowledge of how to create these stories, they can go through wealththroughstories.com/create, correct?
Correct. Yes, well said.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, it's really been amazing. I don't think people really understand what stories can do. And I have a friend of mine who makes a huge living at telling stories. That's all she does. She's a humorist, and she tells stories all the time. And I've seen what she takes. She takes everyday situations and makes them humorous and tells a story. And she is absolutely magnificent at it. And I mean, it's a real gift. But you're saying that people can be taught how to do this if they are open to it and if they want to learn.
Absolutely. And stories, we've talked a little more on a serious level about stories, but stories are fun. They are humorous, and there's often significant points, and we impact people through humor, just like we impact people through stories. So,
Absolutely.
yes.
Absolutely. Well, my guest has been Linda Olson. She is the author of Your Story Matters, 3 Breakthrough Secrets to Stories That Transform. You can find that on Amazon. And you can go to her website, wealththroughstories.com. You can find a little outline on how to do all of this at wealththroughstories.com/create. Thank you so much for being with us today, Linda. It has really been a pleasure.
Oh, thank you, Gayle, for having me on. I have so enjoyed it.
Thanks so much.
Thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed today's show. I choose my guests carefully, so if you have someone you'd like me to interview, please drop me a line at gaylecarson13@gmail.com. In the meantime, check out my intro program, Mindset Matters, at www.sobmindset.com. See you next week.